right. Hi, I'm Jeremy Karaoke with Flying Magazine. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we have gathered four amazing guests to discuss the state of mental health in the aviation industry. Joining us today is first Captain Renee O'Shaughnessy, founder of Piloting to Wellbeing, and author of What You Should Know About Your Pilot's Mental Wellbeing, or Mental Health, sorry. This is your captain speaking. She's also a certified health coach accredited by the Functional Medicine Coaching Academy and has flown as a commercial pilot for over 34 years. Captain O, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Beth Bierke, I hope I said that right, an associate dean and professor at the University of North Dakota, who specializes in aviation education. Thank you for being here today, Professor. Also here is John Hackworth, co-founder of Professional Pilots of Tomorrow. He's a member of the ALPA Pilot Peer Support Network and an A320 pilot instructor at Jetblue. How are you today, sir?
Doing well, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Last but not least, we have Dr. William Hoffman, a neurology resident and aeromedical researcher. Dr. Hoffman, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
The stigma surrounding mental health has previously made it difficult to discuss with friends, family, or employers, but now, especially after the onset of COVID-19, the topic has become a little less taboo for most people. As I understand it, pilots, or perhaps more so than other professions, have a lot riding on their mental health. And to that end, I'd like to start with John Hackworth to talk about the ALPA Pilot Peer Support Network and how that problem tackles the issue. Or sorry, how that program tackles the issue.
Absolutely. So my involvement, really quickly, just to kind of set the tone or stage, with the peer pilot peer support program, started about 4.5 years ago. One of my colleagues reached out to me asking if I had any availability to join the program. And as soon as I learned about it, I was sold. And really what it comes down to is I am a line pilot, and as one, I share, a similar lifestyle to a lot of our fellow colleagues. And whereas I'm not a trained mental health professional, nor are the majority of the volunteers in that program, what we are trained on every year to do is act as a conduit between the resources and the actual professional help that potentially some pilots need, as well as just being an ear, just being there as a fellow colleague, as a fellow human being, for those moments in life where you need to reach out to somebody to unburden yourself and just communicate. So I'd say most of the time when we deal with any sort of calls, what we're really doing is just, again, acting as a fellow human being, as a fellow pilot who understands the situation that they might be in. And first and foremost, one of the cornerstones to the success of this program and many is confidentiality. So, it's a call. Normally, no recorded information of the sort, and 80%, if not more, of those types of calls are just pretty much somebody wanting to vent and express whatever frustration, release their emotion, communicate. In very rare circumstances where, a trained mental health professional is maybe warranted or necessary, that usually gets escalated through the chain of command, where then somebody who is a trained professional can make assessments and so forth. But in a nutshell, that's more or less what it is there, just a peer support program.
And John, have you noticed an increase in the number of pilots calling in either to seek treatment for their mental health issues or for pilot-related mental health incidents?
So, I mean, again, without being able to, provide like a, quantitative, qualitative, actual number or figure, my personal observation is that yes, especially with COVID, I've started to see an increase in the number of phone calls I've received coming in from the call. And again, people call in for a whole various slew of reasons. But yeah, in my personal observation, yeah, I've seen an uptick.
And on a similar note, I'd like to turn to Captain O'Shaughnessy and talk about piloting to well-being and talk about what it is and how that program addresses pilot mental health. Captain O.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. To John's point, over 34 years, I saw a gap in where training has stopped and what pilots need. For example, pilots are struggling out there. 300 million of us are suffering from depression. 40 million of us are suffering from anxiety. And to think that the pilot population is not a subpart of that is just silly. So I created this company called Piloting to Wellbeing, and where we target pilots and especially student pilots. And what we help them do is to navigate the complex world of aviation, to keep them flying and to keep them flying healthy and safely.
Right. And on the subject of students, I'd like to talk to Professor Bierke. Last October, UND experienced a loss of one of its students, and it seems to have jump-started this conversation on mental health across the industry. If I may, how have things changed at UND since then, and what changes are you expecting to see in the near future?
Well, thank you. And like John mentioned, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, I've been in education for over 20 years and I've never seen anything like we've had the last couple years, especially with this subset, these 18 to 22-year-olds. It's been well researched now, well documented that they are suffering. They're suffering from depression, anxiety, and really that sense of belonging you typically get when you join a new college campus, a new college experience. So yes, we started to see a trend that was very disturbing amongst our students and our student pilots. And of course, in October, we did have the tragic accident that really took our conversation from being more internal within our university, talking to our counseling center staff, our student health staff, our faculty, students. We've kind of brought it to a national scale and realized it wasn't just unique to our program. Everyone, these last 2 years have been a struggle, but especially as you're kind of balancing that with a new transition into a demanding career field like aviation. One thing that we are fortunate, and thanks to John and his colleagues at ALPA, is the airlines have been doing some great things for many years that we are now finding out about. In fact, we are very happy to say that we are going to be instituting our own collegiate peer support program within our aviation program this fall. In fact, right now we're recruiting those volunteers, and we were fortunate to sit in on some peer support training at United Airlines. It's helping us guide our path and how we set it up to make it successful within our university, and hopefully that serves as a model for other universities to follow.
Right. And to take a step back, turning this question over to Dr. Hoffman, for those watching who aren't familiar with how medicals are administered, what kind of screening do pilots undergo in order to earn or retain their pilot certificate?
Absolutely. So in some ways, one could think of the aeromedical system as a screening test to screen for aeromedically significant disease. That is a disease, whether it be physical or psychological, that might impact a pilot's ability to perform the required duties. Recognizing that a pilot's duties might be on a spectrum, from your routine operations day to day to operating in extenuating circumstances, for example, in an emergency. And as the current aeromedical system currently exists, it is a extrapolation of the early military medical system for World War I, such that there are tiers of certification based on the pilot's duties and with varying degrees of medical requirements. And based on a pilot's duties and their age, they're required to undergo a certain degree of screening to identify what has been deemed a potentially aeromedically significant condition, and then if they test positive, so to speak, then they undergo a subsequent review at the FAA for more detailed analysis.
All right. And I'd like to read a quote from the FAA's mental fitness page that I feel is a source of anxiety for a lot of pilots. It reads, quote, "Several U.S. airlines already have reporting and monitoring programs that provide the pilot with a path to report their condition, be treated for it, and return to the cockpit once the FAA has determined, through a rigorous evaluation, it is safe to do so." For those who receive a diagnosis during their tenure as a pilot, that might seem like a death sentence for most pilots to report their mental illness and to wait for the FAA to say that they can fly again. How can the industry encourage them to self-report despite that risk? And that can be for anybody in the room, please.
I can start off. I think one of the most important things, especially these young aviators, is to give them some testimonies, give them some examples, some real pilots that have struggled themselves in the past, have gotten the help they needed, and as a result are healthier than ever and back on the flight line. Again, without those testimonies and seeing real people that have gone through this, it is very difficult to have that conversation with an aspiring pilot. Also, we know that it does take time. It does take time to successfully go through that process. And when you're only 18 years old, 6 months to a year seems like a significant part of their life. So again, trying to reiterate that message that taking care of yourself is first and foremost the important thing to do, and then work through that process with them. But the more we can hear success stories that have happened with current pilots, the more impactful that's going to be.
That's a wonderful idea, and I think a really good one. And another one is dispelling misconceptions as well. I will be honest with you, 6 years in the airline industry, and until I joined the pilot peer support program, and more specifically for my carrier, the Pilot Assistant Network, years before I even, as a volunteer, learned about what the actual processes and resources are. And I think what happens often is we hear about one or two instances that turned unfortunately bad for the pilot, and then that becomes the focus point, as opposed to understanding that a vast majority of cases where somebody seeks medical or mental health assistance doesn't necessarily escalate to jeopardy of their career, their license, but we tend to kind of gravitate towards those bad stories and not understand that through education, through testimonies and other such examples, we can understand that no, first and foremost, your mental health is the most important thing, and that it doesn't always necessarily need to be that dire. Like I said, the majority of calls we receive are normally just your day-to-day human being frustration, struggles, anxieties, stressors. So that's, yeah, a really great idea.
Certainly. Now, of course, I only speak for my opinions. I'm not speaking on behalf of the FAA or any other organization, so these are my opinions alone. But there's a couple of points that. Point one is that we don't know to what degree a pilot can have mental health symptoms, to what degree can a pilot be burdened by mental health symptoms, and for it to be aeromedically significant. And to mitigate that risk, the decision at some point in time was that any amount of symptoms is considered aeromedically significant. And that, in some ways, might be one way to argue how we are where we are now, which is if a pilot identifies themselves as having mental health symptoms, that's considered disqualifying and they're pulled from the flight line. Well, while common knowledge would suggest that there might be some competing priorities in disclosing those symptoms, up until recently, there's been very little literature supporting the fact that pilots might participate in healthcare avoidance behavior. And so the small role our group is hopeful to play is in trying to demonstrate the degree of pilot healthcare avoidance. And we recently just published our study, thanks to the help of many, to include multiple airlines and, of course, the University of North Dakota, among other organizations, that demonstrate in the largest study of over 4,000 pilots across the United States that over 56% of them freely admitted to some sort of healthcare avoidance behavior. Now, while those numbers may not be surprising to some colleagues and pilots in the industry, to our knowledge, one of the first numbers trying to define the prevalence. And so while the assumption in aeromedical screening is that pilots, there's 100% sensitive, that is, there's full disclosure, one could make the hypothesis that based on this data, that a subset of pilots may not be disclosing this information, which could have multiple repercussions, to include a pilot not getting the healthcare that they need. I'm a physician who sees patients. I'm not an airline pilot. From my perspective, I see that there's pilots out there who might be suffering from potentially treatable conditions, and there might be factors in the system that discourages care.
Okay, going around the room, I think we can start with Captain O'Shaughnessy. What do you see as a potential solution to removing barriers, either actual or imagined, for pilots when it comes to seeking treatment for their mental health issues?
Well, thanks for asking that question. It's a really good question, and it doesn't have an easy answer. If there was an easy answer, it would have already been answered. So it's multi-pronged. One thing I believe that the FAA could do, and I'm working with others to provide that data, but the barriers of making sure that pilots know that they have their back covered, which means pilots in general, when they go to the FAA for anything, it's usually not for a good thing. So when you disclose a medical issue to the FAA, they got to know that their backs are covered, and that's going to be a real hard thing to do, because the FAA has an obligation to keep the skies safe and to keep the public safe. But yet, as Dr. Hoffman was saying, I for one suffer from anxiety. To put a contact in my eye, I feel my heart racing, I go into sweats, I feel myself really having a panic attack. But I can fly a Cat 3 approach, land an airplane and not see a thing, or land on a slippery runway with crosswinds and snow blowing and not break a sweat. So on the form, think it's 8099, Dr. Hoffman, the form that we have to fill out. It asks for a pilot to identify if he or she has suffered any anxiety. So am I obligated to put down yes because I suffer from anxiety putting a contact in my eye? I think we all can agree that I won't be putting a contact in my eye when I'm shooting an approach down to minimums. So to that point, I think the FAA could do a better job in reformatting the form that we have to all fill out. I think it's a questionnaire that has a wide net, and they're hoping to identify or to catch a few people, and those few people may not know exactly what they're checking off. I just did a keynote at Kent State last week. Now I can't tell you how many young adults came up to me and told me their stories, that they didn't know that if they were checking this off, that meant that, or they took AHAD medicine, Ritalin, when they were 8, 9, 10 years old, and they checked off that box, and now their first class medicals pulled. So you hear those stories over and over and over again. And the FAA is not one to act fast. So yeah, it does take time, but there's a reasonable amount of time that I think the FAA could really streamline that process. And then long term, I think we could really start putting in preventative courses. We have CRM, and 20 some years ago when they introduced CRM, everyone laughed at CRM, calling it a charm school. Well, now we wouldn't think of going through training without CRM. I mean, it's just part of the training. So I think we could put preventative courses in, proactive rather than reactive. I mean, I'll be the first to admit the FAA and each and every airline does a wonderful job with the HIMSS program and such programs. However, that is after the pilot hits the wall. We don't want the pilot to hit the wall. We want to make sure that we're training the whole pilot, not just half of the pilot. And if you think about it as an elite athlete, whether it's football or basketball or baseball, or someone who's training for the Olympics, they have this group of coaches that train the cardio and the strength, but they also have another group of coaches to train the non-technical skills. And that's where I see the FAA could mandate airlines, organizations, to put in those programs such as they did for CRM 20 years ago.
And back to the educational side, I'd like to move this over to Professor Bierke. How does UND make students feel secure enough to report their mental illnesses, and what is your school doing to help students come forward?
So, great question, and kind of piggyback on what Renee was mentioning. I do believe in order to advance this conversation and to make everyone feel more comfortable, is we have to continue the dialogue and continue the collaboration. Not just with the airlines and the pilot unions and the mental health experts in the universities, but also that collaboration with the FAA. Again, working together is how we're going to be able to improve this system. Some of the things that we're doing at our university, which I know I brief with all of my colleagues at the other aviation collegiate schools around the country as well, we're starting to really do a deep dive into not only peer support programs. I mentioned us starting one of those this coming fall semester, but we're also looking at our curriculum. I know I teach our aviation orientation class, and I brought in the Fitness for Flight, some of the components of the ICAO book, and doing mental health well-being bingo challenges that first semester, and really having that conversation. I bring in, again, testimonials and our counseling center staff to talk about the resources. Again, just informing our students so they're educated that these resources do exist. Oftentimes at a college campus, the counseling is free with their tuition and fees that they pay. And so again, that's not always going to make them comfortable using it. That's why, again, they need to hear those success stories of individuals going through. So we are doing kind of a multi-pronged approach in how we kind of educate our students, because I think we'd all agree that the younger you are, and the more you can stay up on this, the healthier you're going to be in the long term in your career, no matter where that career might take you.
And John, being somebody that works and flies with Jetblue, how do you feel that company has valued in taking care of your mental health as a pilot?
Uh, the company as a whole, I think, has a fairly robust health insurance package. So from that basic level right there, that's more than sufficient. But in particular, the union, ALBA, in the last few years, and I think a lot of what we're doing right now, and everything that Renee, Elizabeth, and Dr. Hoffman are talking about, is normalizing the conversation, normalizing and recognizing that we all have mental health issues. And as a direct result of that, I've noticed a huge improvement as far as the visibility of these programs and resources, to include posters all over the crew rooms, as well as in the training environment and other places, so that these resources that are available to not just the pilots but the employees, there's greater visibility. And through that greater visibility, there's, I hope, again, this normalization of recognizing we all struggle from time to time, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of that first and foremost. Jetblue talks about that. We have 5 core main values at the airline, and number 1 is safety. Safety doesn't just mean the safe operation of our aircraft, but also how we take care of ourselves and each other. And I have seen improvements in that. Maybe it's because of a direct result of just how extreme or severe the impact that COVID has had on people. But as a trend across our society, I'm hoping that's the direction we go. One of the things to mention as well is the issue of male toxicity as well, that, boys don't cry. And as pilots, we're supposed to be, A-type driven, mission-oriented individuals, which I think creates just yet another additional layer and complexity. So again, just recognizing, as men and women, of course, but we do have moments where we need to express ourselves. We do need and have vulnerabilities that we need to address and take care of. And I think the more we continue to talk about it and accept it, then some of these paths become more viable and attainable.
I think that brings up a really interesting point, how gender can affect how somebody either exhibits or deals with their mental health. And I think that same kind of difference can be extrapolated over differences in culture or ethnic backgrounds. This question is really for anybody. How do you think the FAA should accommodate for those types of differences and differences in background when it comes to mental health?
Perhaps I can start with that one. From a preventative medicine screening aeromedical lens. As an outsider looking in, it's hard not to take pause at, and again, I speak only for my opinions, not the opinions of others, that this, where the conversation is starting based on background is very striking. Where pilots and pilot organizations are talking about, where that starting point is very different than talking to regulatory folks and what they think about. Again, this is my opinion, no one else's. When considering how we got here and why we're here, it might be helpful to think about it from the lens of a regulator. At the end of the day, the FAA reports not to pilots. It doesn't serve pilots, ultimately. It serves the public. And in aviation across the world, or in the United States, it's exceptionally safe. And this is not my opinion, but one could make the argument, is there a problem here that needs to be addressed from a regulatory perspective? Now, I suspect there might be some people who say yes, a resounding yes, but the disconnect is the lack of data that clearly demonstrates a change, how mental health can impact performance. And there's many facets to that, to include aeromedical redundancies, for example, 2 pilot operations, among many other aeromedical redundancies. But when thinking about it from a regulatory perspective, the gap is that there's not data saying that there's necessarily a safety thing. Now, people can make hypotheses, and what I said may not be popular, but you can certainly make hypotheses, but the definitive data saying that's the case, to my knowledge, doesn't exist. And so from a research perspective, we are working very diligently to try to demonstrate, one, that it does impact, that my hypothesis is that it does impact safety. We know other factors such as sleep, stress, other human factors, things impact safety. But that's more of a long-term aim. From a short-term aim, I will say this. that while I think we look to the FAA and regulators to help us give the answer to this question, I'm not certain that the FAA is necessarily going to be the ones who are going to solve this issue, because that regulatory relationship, does this pilot meet the minimums? Yes, no, that's always going to exist, regardless of what those minimums are, because it's a regulatory organization. But these programs that we can intervene, that we can apply to our organizations, might bring value. And one thing that often comes up, especially in peer support programs in the airlines, and in at UND, that's wonderful, is that some people might say, I don't feel like I have the credentials, I don't feel like I have the training to help people navigate these issues. Keeping in mind what I'm about to say is for routine day-to-day mental health things, not necessarily for somebody with a diagnosed medical condition. But Lampert and colleagues in 2001 published in the American Psychological Association that of people who participate in therapy, what percentage of the benefit is specifically attributed to the methods, meaning like the technical skills. So you go to therapy, what percentage of that therapy is specifically because of how skilled the therapist is? It's about 15%. The major influencers is a therapeutic relationship, a listening ear, validation, and then appropriate boundaries. So I think there's creative ways we can address this, and part of that might be through these peer support programs for day-to-day preventative mental health, not necessarily for medical conditions.
Professor Bierke, what resources are available to your students when it comes to mental health? Just even if they don't have any reported mental illnesses, what resources do they have in order to upkeep their mental health?
Well, and a college campus is always filled with all sorts of resources, and it's a matter of the students. We educate them about them and encourage them to use them, but of course they have to come forward and use them, from a wellness center that puts on all sorts of programming on the different dimensions of wellness to our university counseling center. One of the things I do want to point out that kind of piggybacks on what Dr. Hoffman was mentioning, it's also important for these counselors and therapists to be aviation savvy. That was one of the takeaways from our mental health summit, and we set up and got all of our counseling center staff and our student health staff to go through some online continuing education training to better understand how to work with pilots and how to successfully record those. And we found from our counselors that weren't aviation necessarily specific, is they were a little nervous to work with pilots because they were worried they were going to fill out the form incorrectly, and oftentimes they fill out forms because of what the insurance might dictate. And thankfully, in a university campus, our students do not have to pay for their counseling services, but it was a really good way in which to make them feel more comfortable and more knowledgeable on helping the pilot population.
I'd like to piggyback on Beth's comment. She's absolutely right. There's one thing that I found in 34 years of flying 121 jets is that pilots will communicate with other pilots. They talk their same language. So if you send them into a psychologist's office and the pilot talks about, I'm stressed over commuting. Commuting is a big thing for pilots. They live in Idaho and they have to commute to JFK or vice versa. And commuting is just the way of life for a pilot, and that also adds to the level of stress that a pilot already has in a very high demanding, high performance job. So if you send whether a student pilot or a regular pilot, a line pilot, to someone that doesn't have that experience, that online real life experience, pilots, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, they will sniff that out. They will sniff that out, and then the programs are not very credible because they find that they're just a waste of time. And when I was an active pilot, in my time with the ALPA committees, that's what I have heard and seen in and outside of the cockpit. It's amazing the stories that you hear, right, John? When you're in the cockpit, outside of the cockpit, going coast to coast, going around the world, pilots really open up. But at the end of the day, we are only resource centers. And even though we are a friendly ear, we are really not trained to provide that next step. So when a pilot, I have, in my experience, in my opinion only, when a pilot reaches out to these sources, they're already ready to talk to a professional. It's beyond a friendly conversation.
With ALPA in particular, it's AMAS, the Aviation Medicine Advisory Services is an incredibly valuable resource that when an FAA pilot needs to seek out, mental health or in any sort of actual health from a professional and then subsequently disclose that, through that resource of AMAS, we have doctors on hand who, as we said, are pilot friendly, or should we say pilot savvy, and they understand very well how to navigate the forms, the reporting and such to the FAA. And just being aware of that resource is helpful to encourage pilots who do need to get help know that there is support on their side, who understand the complexities of our jobs as well as the risks inherent in it. And I think it's encouraging. So these programs continue to be refined and developed. And again, just even my first few years flying, I had no idea these things existed. Now that I do, I try to be an advocate for it and communicating to the pilots that it's not always worst case scenario, and that if you do need to seek out and reach to a professional, there is support available to you.
I'd like to aim this next question for Professor Bierke and Dr. Hoffman from a student and a commercial perspective. Say that either a student or a pilot for an airline experiences a problem with their mental health and is removed from the flight line. What does that timeline look like for them to eventually be approved to either join back into their program or to get back in the seat? And we'll start with Professor Bierke.
Well, I'm not a mental health expert or an AME, but based on my experience, it does happen. We don't want a student's education to end because they're going through the medical process with the FAA. We want the student to be healthy first and foremost. But that's also when we advise there's many amazing careers in the aviation industry that do not require medical certification. So perhaps as we're taking the 6 months to a year to figure out our own health, whether it's mental or physical health, and navigating that FAA process, let's continue to explore these other opportunities. We've got a number of aviation degrees in our college that do not require any type of flying. We have a new aviation safeties and operations. So maybe we can start focusing on some of those, learn about the career tracks in there, and once we get our medical sorted out, we can always catch back up on the flying. Again, it is difficult conversations because typically individuals come into this career field because they are passionate about flying, but once they start learning about the other opportunities, they can become just as passionate about those career tracks. So again, we're trying to really highlight some of those exciting careers that don't revolve around having an FAA medical.
Dr. Hoffman?
It's a challenging question, and it's heterogeneous. There's not a clear answer, and there's a lot of independent factors that might contribute to the duration of recertification. Knowing that, in part, for better or worse, that part of the reason why the certification process in the setting of a mental health condition might feel particularly long is intentional, and that is for a FAA psychiatrist or the appropriate medical specialist to determine the disposition of the pilot, and as it relates to their long-term prognosis and what's the direction this is heading. And sometimes that takes 6 months, sometimes that takes longer. And it also speaks to a broader point about, so if a pilot finds themselves in this circumstance, how can they empower themselves with knowledge to navigate the system in a way that will ensure that they get the certification in a safe way if that's in line with their career goals? And that is point one, empower yourself with knowledge. Google the FAA AME guide, Aeromedical Examiner's Guide. There is disposition tables, and it's honestly pretty clear about what can't be certified at the AME's office. And then upon going to, if you need to apply for a special issuance, exactly what's necessary. For example, in a mental health condition, you need to be evaluated by certain types of specialists who need to complete certain types of forms, and they need to discuss certain things. And for better or worse, and it's how the system is set up is that falls on the pilot. So, beyond asking our pilots to be fantastic, high performance athletes and operate airplanes, if I could borrow Captain O's term, because I totally agree with it, we're also asking them to have excellent healthcare literacy, navigating a system, understanding terms, and understanding things from a medical perspective. And that's, unfortunately, is how the system is set up. Not a clear answer on the duration, but to assist yourself is empower yourself with knowledge. That could be the AME guide and finding the appropriate counter partners and navigating the system.
And as a last final question, I just wanted to ask each of you to give a piece of advice to those who may either be struggling with mental health or know somebody that might be struggling with mental health and are in the aviation industry, what would you say to them in order to help lift their spirits or to give them a good idea of what to do with their next steps in either becoming or remaining as a pilot?
Just really quickly, and it's you're not alone. I think sometimes when people are struggling with things, they feel even a greater sense of loneliness, isolation, that there's something maybe wrong with them and all the rest. And again, in line with this normalcy, it's recognizing, acknowledging they are not alone, not only how they feel and that what they're going through, but that there's many people out there that are there to help them. And there's a lot of resources. They're not alone.
I would say to take care of yourself first and foremost, so that you can live that exciting career no matter where it may take you.
I guess it's my turn. We all have mental health, me, you, and everyone, because we're human. And we are entitled to the basic human right of being well.
Yeah, if the human emotion is a spectrum. Feeling low can be a part of a normal symptom, and it can also be part of a medical condition. In the circumstance of having a medical condition, 100% get the care that you need as soon as possible. While there might be short-term repercussions as it relates to your medical certificate, that's how you can ensure that that your health can be a tool for you long-term. So if you need your medical care, get it as soon as possible, and that'll help you in the long term. But also importantly is, I'm so humbled by the people on this discussion and by the many people who are working on this issue that sometimes I'm just even take pause in the reassurance pilots feel in knowing that there are a lot of people who are working very hard on this issue, because pilots are heard and this is something that we can really potentially help a lot of people. So just knowing that there's a lot of work being done on this issue.
All right. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. I'd like to once again thank all of you for speaking with us today. And thanks to everybody for watching. You can check the rest of our Mental Health Awareness Month coverage at flyingmag.com, where you can subscribe to get all the latest. I'm Jeremy Karaoke with Flying, and we'll see you next time.